The smell of scorched grease and salt-crusted iron usually meant home. But tonight, Grace's hands are shaking so hard she can barely grip the heavy wrench. On the grease-stained counter of her family's restaurant lies a document she's never seen, bearing a signature that looks exactly like her own, next to a debt that could bury the entire harbor. Outside, the rhythmic, metallic thud of a heavy boot against the shipyard gate echoes through the fog, followed by a low, jagged laugh that makes the hair on her neck stand up. Someone is coming to collect on a lie she didn't tell, and the person she trusts most is currently whistling a tune in the next room, hiding a blood-red gambling receipt in his pocket. A sudden, sharp crack of breaking glass shatters the silence of the docks. Grace lunges for the window just in time to see a shadow darting away from her father's last remaining trawler, the smell of gasoline beginning to override the scent of the sea. As the first orange flicker of a flame licks against the hull, she realizes the locks have been changed from the inside. She isn't just fighting to save her business anymore. She's trapped in a house where the walls are closing in. Realized too late that the predator isn't at the door. He's already sitting at her dinner table, smiling at her mother. Grace Callahan pressed her icy palm against the searing steel surface of the commercial range, desperate to quell the tremors in her fingers. The air in the kitchen hung heavy, a thick soup of scorched bacon grease and the caustic tang of industrial-grade degreaser. She grabbed 2 massive cast-iron skillets, the heat radiating through her skin as the familiar sting of calluses met the unyielding, grit-covered metal. Sweat tracked a slow, salty path down her spine, the moisture soaking into the thin, overworked fabric of her stained server's apron. Moving with the mechanical precision of a woman living on the edge of exhaustion, she flipped open the cash register to count the meager lunch rush takings. Her eyes skipped over the crumpled bills, focusing instead on the stack of unpaid electric bills pinned to the corkboard like a death warrant. She scrubbed a laminate tabletop with a damp rag, her joints throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache from hours of repetitive motion. Every chime of the bell above the front door struck her temples like a physical blow, a herald of more demands she couldn't meet. The walk from the restaurant to the harbor offered no respite, only a shift in the sensory assault. Grace inhaled the sharp, biting scent of oxidized iron and briny Atlantic water as she stepped onto the weathered planks of the Callahan shipyard. She knelt beside the exposed engine of the first trawler, her wrench biting into stubborn bolts while cold, black lubricant splattered across her cheeks and work clothes. The main wind, a cruel and persistent guest, whistled through the gaps in the ship's peeling hull, numbing her fingers until they felt like wooden pegs. Frustration boiled over when a rusted lever refused to budge. She swung a heavy mallet with a primal grunt, the impact vibrating through her shoulder in a pulse of white-hot pain. To her left, the second vessel groaned on its wooden supports, a skeletal reminder of her father's legacy as she scraped away thick crusts of barnacles. She leaned against the damp hull, lungs burning, and stared out at the murky, slate-gray waters of Port Arthur. The sun dipped below the horizon, bathing her oil-stained, bruised hands in a deceptive crimson light as she methodically packed her tools into a battered wooden chest. A sleek black taxi pulled to the curb in front of the family home, its polished finish a jarring intrusion against the town's salt-worn grayness. Nate Callahan stepped out, adjusting the collar of a charcoal cashmere coat that cost more than Grace's monthly mortgage payment. From the porch, Helen Callahan let out a piercing cry of joy, her boots clattering on the wood as she rushed to throw her arms around her son. She rained frantic, wet kisses across Nate's face, her eyes blinded by tears of relief, failing to see the way his gaze wandered toward the harbor with a cold, detached calculation. Helen hovered around him like a moth to a flame, snatching up his pristine leather suitcase and lamenting the supposed weight he had lost in the city. Nate offered a practiced, condescending smile, his hand patting his mother's cheek with a rhythmic, hollow affection. Inside, Helen was already frantic, spreading the finest lace tablecloths over the scarred wood of the dining table, oblivious to the fact that the refrigerator held little more than condiments and hope. Blind adoration radiated from her as Nate slid into their late father's leather armchair, claiming the space as if he had never left. The domestic illusion shattered when Grace dropped a thick stack of eviction notices onto the table, the bright red final demand stamps glaring under the dim dining room light. Helen didn't even look at the papers. She simply swept them toward the edge of the table to make room for a steaming bowl of beef stew she had prepared for Nate. Grace leaned forward, her voice a low vibration of urgency as she pointed to the negative balance printed in bold ink on the bank statement. Helen ignored her, letting out a bright, artificial peal of laughter at one of Nate's anecdotes about New York, her hand steady as she poured him a glass of expensive Merlot. Under the table, Grace's fingernails dug into her palms, her jaw tight as Helen begged her not to spoil Nate's appetite with boring numbers. With a flourish of theatrical dismissal, Helen plucked one of the legal warnings from the pile and stuffed it into the overflowing trash can, her eyes never leaving her son's face. Grace's voice wavered, a plea for reality. But Helen simply reached over to pull the heavy velvet curtains shut, sealing them into a world where the debt didn't exist. Later that night, Nate slipped through the grease-stained back door of a nondescript warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. The interior was a tomb of stale cigarette smoke and the medicinal sting of cheap rye whiskey. He approached a table draped in pilled green felt, his movements fluid and desperate as he produced a roll of bills, the very cash Grace had painstakingly set aside for the ship's engine parts. His eyes took on a feverish, glassy sheen under the low-hanging lamps, while the dealer's hands blurred, snapping cards onto the felt. Nate's fingers drummed a frantic tattoo on the table's edge, his pupils tracking the movement of the plastic chips with the intensity of a starving predator. With every losing hand, the ruddy color drained from his face, and the pile of family savings began to evaporate into the house's coffers. He shoved the final remains of the repair fund onto a weak pair of jacks, only to watch the dealer's rake sweep the last of the Callahan future away. Nate stumbled out into the salt-thick night, wiping a film of cold sweat from his forehead with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. The following afternoon, the restaurant's peace was violated by two men in heavy leather jackets who kicked a chair aside as they approached the counter. Grace felt the sudden, oppressive weight of a cheap cologne and a very expensive threat when the taller man slapped a photocopy of a loan agreement onto the laminate. Her breath hitched in her throat. There, at the bottom of the page, was a crude imitation of her own signature next to a figure with 4 zeros. The collector slammed his palm down on the counter, the force making the glassware on the shelves behind Grace chatter in a frantic, high-pitched chorus. She went bone white, her gaze locked on the flat, predatory eyes of the stranger who was now demanding an immediate payment on the interest alone. She tried to form the words, to explain that she had never seen this contract, that the ink was a lie. But the man only offered a jagged, mirthless grin. Grace gripped the hem of her apron until her knuckles turned white. The floor beneath her feet seeming to tilt as the weight of a brother's betrayal began to crush her. Retreating to the small office in the back, Grace logged into the online banking portal, her pulse a frantic drum in her ears. A long, scrolling list of transactions appeared, all of them processed in the dead of night at an hour when only the desperate were awake. A hollow, frozen void opened in her chest as she stared at the 0.00 balance on the savings account she had guarded like a sanctuary. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed, as she cross-referenced the times of the withdrawals with the nights Nate had claimed to be clearing his head at the docks. Reaching into the pocket of Nate's discarded jacket hanging on the door, she found what she feared: a crumpled thermal paper receipt from the Blue Anchor gambling den. tucked deep behind the lining. She pressed her face into her hands, the metallic taste of bile rising in her throat as the full scope of the disaster settled over her. Nate was in the next room, his cheerful whistling a sharp contrast to the silence of her ruin. He hadn't just taken the money. He had dismantled the only bridge they had left to cross. "Where is it, Nate?" Grace's voice cracked the air as she threw the empty checkbook onto the table in front of him. Nate's expression shifted instantly, the bravado of the city boy vanishing to reveal a cowering, pathetic child as he scrambled to hide behind Helen's chair. Helen surged to her feet, a mother bear protecting a cub, her face contorting with a sudden, sharp rage directed solely at her daughter. Nate let out a staged, shuddering sob, spinning a frantic tale of how Grace had always envied him, how she had looked for reasons to tear him down since the funeral. Helen shoved Grace toward the kitchen door, her voice a shrill weapon, ordering her to shut her mouth and stop accusing her brother of such filthy lies. Grace shouted about the receipts, the empty accounts, the literal theft of their father's sweat. But Helen only pulled Nate's head to her shoulder, stroking his hair with a fierce, delusional protective instinct. Over his mother's shoulder, Nate's eyes cleared of tears for a split second, flashing a look of pure, triumphant malice. Driven by a desperate need for a solution, Grace sat in the sterile, airless office of the Port Arthur Savings and Loan. A woman in a charcoal suit, her expression as flat as the desk between them, laid out a spreadsheet of delinquent payments on the restaurant's mortgage. Grace listened to the monotonic drone of the clerk's voice as she explained the legal framework of foreclosure, her words stripping away the history of the Callahan name. The air in the room felt thick as wool, making every breath a conscious effort of will. On the monitor, a digital red stamp appeared over their account number. Frozen, a mark that effectively erased decades of her father's grueling labor on the sea. Grace stood up and walked out of the bank, her vision blurring at the edges as she stared at the weather-beaten anchor sign hanging above the restaurant. She had exactly 14 days before a locksmith would arrive to turn the legacy of her family into a line item on a bank's asset sheet. The smell of old paper and ink filled the notary's office as Grace laid out the deed to her personal share of the family home. She picked up the pen, the plastic feeling heavy and alien in her hand, and watched the black ink flow across the signature line like a slow-moving oil slick. She accepted the envelope of cash, a fraction of the home's value, but enough to buy the fuel and the winch cables needed to get the trawler back into the water. Her heart performed a slow, painful contraction at the realization that if the next catch failed, she would be homeless by the end of the month. Walking down the hallway, she clutched the bag to her chest, a shield against the mounting pressure of the world outside. She glanced at the framed photos of her father on the walls, feeling the stinging heat of shame as if she were a traitor to the very foundations of the house. She didn't go home. She headed straight for the docks, where the smell of diesel and salt promised the only honest fight she had left. On the outskirts of town, where the street lights were few and the shadows long, Nate leaned against the door of a black SUV. He unrolled a set of architectural plans on the hood, his finger tracing the perimeter of the Callahan shipyard with a frantic, greedy energy. He spoke in a low, conspiratorial murmur to the man in the driver's seat, discussing the price for a clean, fast sale of the entire waterfront plot. The buyer, a representative of a development firm Grace had already rejected twice, handed over a thick envelope of earnest money. Nate's fingers twitched as he felt the weight of the bills. A down payment on a betrayal he intended to finalize before Grace could even get the boat in the water. The basement of the Port Arthur Harbor Archive smelled of damp earth and decomposing leather, a scent that clung to Grace's clothes as she turned the yellowed pages of the registry. The flickering light of a single bare bulb revealed the maritime records, where the name Callahan had been crudely obscured by thick, white correction fluid. She traced the indentation of the paper with her thumb, noting the elegant, sharp script of Sterling Holdings written over the erasure. Her heart hammered against her ribs when she saw the dates of the alterations. They aligned perfectly with the afternoon Nate had claimed to be helping with the city paperwork. The dust of decades settled in her throat as she realized that her family's legal claim to the shipyard hadn't just been challenged. It had been systematically deleted. While Grace choked on the dust of the archives, Nate was enjoying the filtered air of the Onyx Club, reclining against a tufted leather sofa. Across from him sat Martin Lawrence, the developer whose gold watch caught the low light like a predator's eye. Nate pulled a folder toward him, his skin prickling at the touch of the heavy, embossed paper containing the demolition agreement for the historic Callahan piers. Lawrence blew a slow, deliberate plume of smoke toward the ceiling, watching with a shark-like detachment as Nate signed away the structures his grandfather had built with his own hands. Nate's lips curled into a smirk as a heavy envelope was slid across the mahogany table. The only sound in the opulent room was the muted, rhythmic snap of $100 bills as Nate counted his price, his eyes reflecting a shallow, desperate greed. The horror at the shipyard was a physical weight when Grace arrived the next morning. She stood paralyzed, staring at the severed ends of the heavy mooring lines that lay like dead snakes across the oil-slicked concrete. She scrambled onto the deck of the primary trawler, the air inside the cabin thick with the cloying chemical stench of acetone and wet enamel. The expensive navigation screen had been doused in a thick, viscous red paint that was still dripping onto the console, looking disturbingly like fresh blood. Grace touched the sticky surface, a hot surge of fury rising in her chest as she noticed the deep, intentional gouges carved into the expensive sonar equipment. The boat rocked gently in the swell, the damaged machinery emitting a rhythmic, metallic shriek that sounded like a wounded animal. She gripped a jagged end of the cut rope, the frayed nylon fibers biting into the sensitive skin of her palm. Nate moved through the dark hallway of the family home with the silence of a thief. Entering Helen's bedroom where the air was sweet with lavender and the medicinal tang of her heart pills, he eased open the drawer of the heavy oak dresser, his breath held tight to avoid waking the sleeping woman. His fingers found the cool, polished wood of the jewelry box, where Helen kept the family's vital records alongside her pearls. He slid out the original property deeds and the general power of attorney, tucking the crisp papers beneath his shirt. The lock on the box made a soft, final click as he closed it, leaving the sanctuary of the drawer empty of its history. He glanced once at Helen's peaceful, trusting face before slipping out of the room. The stolen legacy, a cold weight against his ribs. The confrontation happened in the shipyard office, a space cramped with maps and old ledgers. Grace burst in to find Nate hunched over a desk, a fountain pen in his hand as he meticulously forged Helen's signature onto a land transfer deed. He jumped at the sound of the door, knocking over an inkwell that sent a dark, spreading stain across the developer's contract. Grace lunged forward, seizing his wrist before he could hide the document, her eyes locking onto the fraudulent loops of the signature. Nate thrashed, trying to break her grip, but she held on with the strength of a woman who had spent her life hauling nets. She pointed at the wet ink, her voice a low, dangerous vibration as she called out the lie. Nate's eyes darted around the room like a trapped rat's. But Grace was faster, ripping the incriminating paper from his shaking fingers. She didn't wait. She ran straight to the house and threw the forged documents onto Helen's lap in the middle of the living room. Helen picked up the papers with a slow, deliberate lack of interest, her gaze fixed on Grace with a simmering, irrational resentment. Without reading a single word, Helen gripped the edges of the documents and tore them in half, the sound of ripping paper like a gunshot in the quiet room. The white fragments drifted down to the rug, looking like dirty snow against the floral pattern. Helen stood up, her shadow looming over Grace, and accused her of being a bitter, jealous girl who was trying to destroy her brother's reputation to steal the business for herself. Her voice shook with a terrifying, blind conviction as she called Grace ungrateful. Grace looked at the torn evidence on the floor, the realization sinking in that Helen would rather drown in Nate's lies than swim in the truth. The humiliation moved to the public sphere when Helen marched Grace onto the front porch in full view of the neighbors who were gathered for the upcoming festival. With a sharp, practiced motion, Helen's hand connected with Grace's cheek, the sound of the slap echoing off the nearby houses. Grace's skin erupted in a stinging, white-hot bloom of pain, but she didn't move. Helen screamed for the keys to the family safe, calling Grace a thief and a cancer on this family, in front of the whispering townsfolk. Nate stood just behind his mother, a look of faux sorrow on his face that didn't quite hide the gleam of victory in his eyes. Helen shrieked that Grace was officially stripped of any authority over the Callahan estate. Grace slowly reached into her pocket for the keys, the judgmental stares of her neighbors feeling like shards of glass against her skin. When Grace returned to the shipyard, the physical blockade had begun. Two massive, bright yellow excavators were parked across the main entrance, their steel buckets resting on the asphalt like sleeping predators. Men in high-visibility vests and hard hats emblazoned with the Sterling logo were already stringing coils of razor wire along the perimeter fence, ignoring Grace's shouts. She tried to shove her way toward the main equipment shed, but the roar of a diesel engine drowned her out as a machine lurched forward, belching a cloud of black, acrid smoke. One of the foremen stepped into her path, his shoulder catching hers with a dismissive force as he hung a "Private Property, No Trespassing" sign on the gate. The ground vibrated with the mechanical pulse of the construction equipment, a rhythmic thrum that signaled the end of her sanctuary. The mail brought the final legal blow, a heavy envelope from the county court. Grace's eyes blurred as she waded through the dense thicket of heretofore and notwithstanding until she found the core of the message. A legal loophole, a tiny clause Nate had inserted into the power of attorney she had signed months ago, had been used to voluntarily relinquish her residency rights to the family home. She collapsed onto a kitchen chair, the walls of the house she had grown up in suddenly feeling like the bars of a cage. Every sentence in the letter was a precision strike against her past, an official decree that she was now a guest in her own life. She crumpled the paper in her fist, the dry, rasping sound of the parchment the only noise in the suffocating silence of the kitchen. In the pre-dawn gray of the shipyard, Grace caught a flicker of movement on the deck of her cater. A shadow in a dark hoodie was crouched near the engine hatch, the unmistakable sharp scent of gasoline wafting through the damp air. She heard the rhythmic glug-glug of liquid being poured onto the deck plates, a sound that made her blood run cold. The figure struck a match, the brief flare of orange light illuminating a pair of eyes that were devoid of anything but a cold, mercenary intent. Grace lunged for the intruder, but he shoved her back with a blunt force that sent her sprawling against the railing. He leapt over the side, disappearing into the black water of the harbor just as a small tongue of flame began to lick at a gasoline-soaked rag. Grace scrambled for the heavy red fire extinguisher mounted near the wheelhouse, her lungs seizing as black, oily smoke began to fill the confined space. She squeezed the trigger, a cloud of white chemical foam erupting into the engine bay, fighting back the heat that was already blistering the paint on the bulkheads. She coughed violently, the taste of soot and chemicals coating her tongue, her vision tunneling as she refused to let go of the trigger until the last spark was smothered. When the air finally cleared, she slumped against the charred remains of the engine housing, her hands red and pulsing with the heat of the fire. She stared at the blisters forming on her palms, the physical pain finally matching the internal agony of knowing her brother was willing to burn their father's memory to the ground for a paycheck. The Port Arthur Day of the Fisherman Festival was a cacophony of forced cheer, the air thick with the smell of deep fryers and the cloying pink scent of spun sugar. And brass band blared a march that felt like a rhythmic assault on Grace's senses, their notes competing with the constant, screeching cries of the gulls overhead. Under the harsh, artificial glare of the stage lights, Helen Callahan stood with a practiced, regal poise. Grace watched from the edge of the crowd as her mother reached up to unfasten the heavy gold chain from her own neck, the one carrying their father's signet ring. With the solemnity of a coronation, Helen took Nate's hand and slid the massive ring onto his finger. The central ruby caught a beam of light, flashing a deep, bloody crimson as Nate raised his hand to acknowledge the cheering crowd. Grace felt the Maine cold seep into her marrow, a frozen realization that the town was applauding the man who was currently selling them out. Behind the heavy, dust-choked velvet curtains of the main stage, Grace cornered her mother, her voice a low, desperate hiss. Helen didn't flinch. Her eyes were hard as flint, her mouth set in a line of unyielding granite. With a chilling, quiet efficiency, Helen admitted that she had seen the gambling debts, the forged signatures, and the empty bank accounts. She gripped Grace's elbows, her fingers like iron talons, and confessed that she had liquidated every family asset and pawned the Callahan heirlooms just to keep Nate from a prison cell. Grace felt the air leave her lungs as she realized that Helen wasn't a victim of Nate's lies. She was his most dedicated accomplice. The backstage area smelled of dry rot and ancient stage makeup, a fitting tomb for the last of Grace's illusions about her mother's love. "Go, Grace," Helen whispered, her eyes tracking the movement of people on the other side of the curtain. She pointed toward the rear exit, where the neon exit sign cast a sickly red glow over the puddles on the concrete floor. She ordered Grace to leave the festival and the city immediately, claiming that Grace's bitterness and work-worn clothes would only embarrass the family now that Nate was taking his rightful place in society. The words were a physical assault, sharper than any blow Grace had ever sustained on the docks. Helen adjusted her pearls and stated that Grace's presence was an insult to the new beginning Nate was providing for them. Grace stood frozen in the shadows, watching as the woman who raised her turned and walked toward the light of the banquet hall without a single backward glance. Grace tried to make a break for the stage, but Nate intercepted her in the narrow corridor leading to the equipment room. The space was cramped, smelling of industrial bleach and the damp earthiness of stored produce. He slammed her against a metal shelving unit, the impact sending a dozen heavy cans of tomatoes crashing to the floor with a series of dull, metallic thuds. He lunged for the leather folder she had tucked under her arm, his fingers digging into her ribs with a brutal, frantic strength. Grace felt the heat of his breath, sour with the smell of celebratory whiskey, as he snarled a demand for the original forged documents. She jammed her knee into his midsection, her breath hitching as his fingernails tore the edge of the folder. Both of them locked in a silent, desperate struggle in the dim light of the pantry. The heavy oak door to the storage room slammed shut, the sound of the deadbolt sliding home, final and chilling. Grace heard the heavy footsteps of two of Martin Lawrence's security team as they took up positions outside, their shadows blocking the sliver of light beneath the door. Nate stepped back, his chest heaving as he straightened his silk tie, giving a curt, sharp nod to the men he had hired to silence his sister. Grace watched the silhouette of one guard as he adjusted his holster, while the other began a slow, rhythmic pounding of his fist into his palm. The single bulb in the ceiling flickered and hummed, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to lean in toward her. Nate left her there in the dark, a prisoner of his greed, ensuring she wouldn't be able to reach the microphone before the final papers were signed. Desperation lent Grace a strength she didn't know she possessed. She scanned the cluttered room until her eyes landed on a glass-fronted emergency cabinet. She shattered the glass with her elbow, ignoring the stinging slices of the shards, and gripped the handle of a heavy fire axe. With a grunt of effort, she swung the blade into the door's wooden panel, the impact vibrating through her arms and into her teeth. Nate's voice rose in a panicked shriek from the other side, ordering her to stop. But she swung again, the steel biting deep into the oak. Splinters sprayed her face like shrapnel as she focused on the area around the lock, her movements fueled by a lifetime of suppressed rage. With one final, shattering blow, she kicked through the ruined wood and saw Nate's wide, terrified eyes staring back at her through the hole she had made. She burst out onto the plaza, her boots skidding on the pavement as she shoved through the throngs of tourists and locals. She ran with a frantic, stumbling energy, her eyes locked on the elevated platform where the town's future was being decided. On stage, Martin Lawrence was already uncapping a heavy gold pen, while Nate slid the final demolition contract across the table with a trembling hand. Grace tripped over a strand of festive bunting, her knees hitting the wood. But she scrambled up, clutching the folder to her chest like a holy relic. The mayor's voice boomed through the loudspeakers, a distorted roar that echoed off the harbor buildings, announcing the rebirth of Port Arthur. Grace felt the sting of sweat in her eyes as she saw Lawrence's pen descend toward the signature line. She looked up at the massive LED screen looming over the square, where a high-definition rendering of the new Port Arthur was playing. In the digital world, the Callahan restaurant, the place where she had spent every Christmas and every grueling double shift, was gone, replaced by a gleaming glass tower. She watched as a virtual wrecking ball swung through the image of her childhood home, turning it into a manicured lawn for wealthy weekenders. The cold blue light of the screen made her skin look like marble, while Nate stood on stage, nodding in approval at the destruction of their history. The crowd around her let out a collective, appreciative ooh, their faces tilted up in awe, completely blind to the fact that they were cheering for the burial of the town's soul. Grace reached the stairs to the podium, but Nate's hand clamped onto her shoulder like a vice. He yanked her backward with a force that nearly dislocated her arm, his fingers bruising the muscle as a cry of pain escaped her lips. He leaned in, his voice a low, toxic whisper in her ear, promising that if she took another step, he would make sure she drifted out to sea and never came back. Grace felt the tremor in his hand, not from fear, but from a volatile, cornered rage. He used his body as a shield, blocking the narrow walkway to the mayor's microphone, his face inches from hers. She looked into his eyes and saw a man who had completely detached from reality, a man who would kill to keep his mask of success from slipping. Searching for any flicker of humanity, Grace locked eyes with Helen, who was standing just feet away from Martin Lawrence. Helen saw Nate twisting Grace's arm behind her back, forcing her to double over in agony. Instead of calling for help, Helen simply reached up to smooth her hair, a small, approving nod, directed at Nate, as if he were merely disciplining a wayward child. Grace saw a flash of cold, clinical satisfaction in her mother's gaze. A look that said Grace finally deserved the pain she was receiving for being difficult. Helen stepped closer to Lawrence, physically aligning herself with the money and the power, and turned her back on her daughter's struggle. The last thread of Grace's hope for family loyalty snapped, leaving nothing but a cold, hard clarity in its place. The pain in her shoulder reached a white-hot peak, and in that moment, Grace understood the terminal nature of her situation. She realized that the time for quiet dignity and private pleas had been buried under the weight of Nate's greed and Helen's delusions. There was no way to win this through the proper channels or through a change of heart. The only way to stop the pen from touching the paper was to burn the entire theater down. She knew that to save the shipyard, She would have to destroy the Callahan name in front of every person who had ever respected it. Grace threw her weight backward, the fabric of her shirt tearing with a sharp rip as she wrenched her arm free from Nate's grasp. She lunged forward, her heavy work boots thudding against the hollow wood of the stage like a drumbeat. She slammed her shoulder into the tall chrome microphone stand, sending the device toppling into the carpet with a piercing, electronic shriek of feedback. The mayor jumped back, his hands flying to his ears, as Grace stood over the table of contracts, her chest heaving. The silence that followed the feedback was absolute. A vacuum that sucked the air out of the plaza. Nate stood at the bottom of the steps, his mouth hanging open in a silent oh of shock, as Grace stared down at the men who were trying to buy her life. She moved toward the large television camera on the edge of the stage, the small red light of the live broadcast glowing like an angry eye. She slammed the yellowed, forged documents against the glass of the lens, her fingers trembling but her grip firm. In the monitor, she saw her own sweat-streaked, soot-stained face, a stark contrast to the polished liars behind her. She pointed to the shaky, inconsistent loops of the signatures, highlighting the places where Nate's hand had wavered as he tried to mimic their mother's handwriting. The high-intensity stage lights shone through the paper, turning the evidence into a transparent map of Nate's crimes. She didn't say a word at first, letting the visual evidence of the fraud broadcast into every living room in the county. Grace filled her lungs with the salt-tinged air and let out a voice that had been forged in the roar of the shipyard. She shouted the exact figures of the kickbacks Lawrence had promised Nate, her words cutting through the remnants of the band's music like a blade. She recited the account numbers Nate had used to funnel the shipyard's operating funds into his gambling debts, her voice ringing with a terrifying, metallic certainty. She watched the blood drain from Martin Lawrence's face as he realized his clean deal was being dismantled in real time. She didn't stop, detailing the conspiracy between the developer and the addict, until the crowd below began to murmur with a growing, restless anger. With a final, sharp movement, Grace hurled the leather folder at Lawrence's attorney, the impact hitting him squarely in the chest. The folder burst open, and dozens of papers cascaded through the air like wounded birds, landing on the attorney's expensive shoes and the polished stage floor. Grace shouted for the local press to look at the watermarks, to see the dates that didn't align with the legal filings. The attorney scrambled to gather the sheets, but Grace planted her boot on the corner of a crucial bank statement, pinning it to the wood. The air was filled with the frantic clicking of cameras as journalists surged toward the stage, their flashes blinding as they captured the physical proof of the Callahan collapse. Martin Lawrence slammed his gold pen onto the table, the nib snapping and leaving a jagged black blotch across the signature line of the contract. He stood up, his face a mask of cold fury, and loudly announced that all negotiations were terminated indefinitely, pending a criminal investigation into the validity of the documents. Two of Lawrence's security guards grabbed Grace by the shoulders, their fingers digging into her skin as they tried to drag her away from the podium. She kicked out, her heel catching the edge of the heavy oak table, her eyes locked on Lawrence as he turned and fled the stage. He disappeared into the tinted sanctuary of his SUV, leaving Nate standing alone in the center of the stage, the golden boy now tarnished beyond recognition. Helen Callahan climbed the steps of the podium, the crowd parting for her as if she were a ghost. She stopped in front of Grace, her face frozen into a mask of such profound hatred that it seemed to vibrate. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she spoke with a dry, rattling whisper that sounded like dead leaves on a driveway, telling Grace that she no longer had a daughter. Grace watched as her mother purposefully turned her back, an act of social execution that erased Grace from the family history in a single motion. Helen took Nate by the arm, her chin held high as she led him toward the rear exit, acting as if they were the victims of a terrible tragedy. Grace felt the final chord of her old life snap, the silence of her mother's rejection more deafening than the roar of the crowd. Ignoring the venomous looks Helen threw over her shoulder, Grace turned toward a massive police officer who had climbed onto the stage. She reached into the inner pocket of her work jacket and pulled out the original whiskey-stained debt markers she had taken from the Blue Anchor. The officer took the slips, his eyes narrowing as he compared the signatures to the documents on the table. Grace spoke in a calm, detached tone, describing the exact mechanics of how Nate had used the shipyard as collateral for his addiction. The red and blue lights of the arriving patrol cars began to pulse against the buildings, painting Grace's face in a rhythmic, jarring light. She felt a strange, hollowed-out peace as she watched the officer begin to fill out a formal arrest report. She walked back into the restaurant, the silence inside a heavy, physical thing that made her ears ring. She turned the dial on the old floor safe in the office, the mechanical click, 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 the only sound in the empty building. She pulled out her father's leather-bound logbook, the scent of his pipe tobacco still clinging to the pages like a memory. She gathered her own keys and a small, rusted set of hand tools, stuffing them into a canvas bag that had seen better decades. She took the heavy ring of keys for the restaurant and the house and set them on the bar, right next to a half-empty glass of rye Nate had left behind. She took one last look at the grease-stained walls and the faded photos of the harbor before walking out the door and locking it from the outside for the very last time. The pier was a gauntlet of shadows and cold wind. Grace watched from the edge of the wharf as Nate stumbled toward his car, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He yanked at the door handle, but a group of men in heavy leather jackets, the creditors, stepped out of the darkness to block his path. Grace stood still as Nate fell to his knees in the dirt, his hands raised in a pathetic plea for mercy. Just as a police cruiser skidded to a halt behind him, he tried to scramble into the back seat of his own car, but the officers were faster, pinning him against the glass with a cold, professional efficiency. She watched the red taillights of the police car fade into the dust, Nate's face a pale, distorted blur behind the window. Grace stepped onto the deck of her cater, the familiar, comforting groan of the timber a better welcome than anything the town had offered. She drew a sharp, serrated knife from her belt and, with a single powerful stroke, severed the thick hemp mooring line that held her to the Port Arthur docks. The cut end of the rope hit the water with a heavy splash, the last physical connection to her father's debt-ridden estate sinking into the dark. The current began to catch the hull, pulling her slowly away from the pier. She stood at the railing, watching as the silhouettes of the shipyard cranes and the lights of the festival began to shrink into the mist. The town that had raised and then rejected her, becoming a ghost on the shoreline. She reached for the ignition, her heart skipping a beat as she turned the key. The massive diesel engine coughed once and then erupted into a deep, rhythmic roar that shook the very marrow of her bones. A powerful vibration traveled from the deck plates through the soles of her boots, a pulse of pure, unadulterated potential. She shoved the throttle forward, the boat lurching as the propeller bit into the cold Atlantic water, leaving a wide, churning wake of white foam behind her. The lights of the plaza were nothing more than dying embers on the horizon now, and the weight of the last 3 decades seemed to evaporate into the salt spray hitting her face. Grace gripped the wheel with a steady, certain hand, her eyes fixed on the empty, honest expanse of the open sea. Grace Callahan steered the nose of the ship toward the first light of dawn. The horizon, a promise of a world where the only debt she owed was to the wind and the water.